concept that we could actually ask for a fanfare at the beginning of the season, a 4 or 5 minute piece, and then ask her to develop it for later in the season. And that worked, because now, far from being a promising young composer, she's one of the most busy young composers on the scene.
The very opening of the piece is, I wanted to have this very, very high fanfare for violins, and it uses a lot of very high notes. In around 2005, there was these two schemes. There was the Panufnik scheme and the Sound Adventures. And so I applied for the Sound Adventures. And the idea was that you would write a 5-minute piece. I'd been wanting to write an orchestral piece for a while, and I'd written an oboe concerto for myself to play, which was chamber orchestra and solo oboe. I had lots of ideas for combining different layers in music, and that's something which has become increasingly more important for me. And of course that's something which you can really play with an orchestra. So I really wanted to apply for this, and I did, and was really pleased to get the opportunity to write a piece for the London Symphony Orchestra. So this is where I do most of my work. So I work in the spare bedroom in my house. And so I've got my keyboard, my clavinova, which I've had since about the year 2000 or something. It's still going. And I like that because I don't really like people. I bang a lot of stuff out. And so I'm writing a lot at the piano, and I use the sketch paper, and I use pretty much all of it, you can see. I've been inspired by poetry, and more often as not lately it's been visual art. And it's amazing actually how, when I move away from that sort of verbal stuff later on, when I look back at it later in the process, that I have actually sort of really sort of kept a real connection to that. Everything springs from sort of getting that central material right, and it will have consequences elsewhere. And I like for there to be that sort of mystical element in what I'm doing. I have a clear idea of what I want to do, but I like for things to change and evolve and to take their own direction. I want to write music which actually feels quite natural and feels inevitable, but to be able to really play with that as well. And that sounds sort of an easy thing to do, but to make something sound the way that I think is very inevitable, and to sound right, or my idea of right, takes a long time. And that's one of the things which is exciting about composing for me. It's not a case of sort of writing down what I want to do and sticking to that plan, because that's not really interesting to me. It's about seeing how this thing will become its own sort of sound world. Well, this is some material that I've been working for near the opening of the fanfare, the short piece. So I had this idea that I wanted there to be a number of different fanfares in this opening piece, in different ways, but I wanted it to open with quite a quiet but bright and clear, very high fanfare for violins. Then it starts in the first violins, and then it moves between the two violin sections. And so I've been working on the interplay between the two of them. It's very syncopated, it's very rhythmic. And there's very contrasted, very bright running material in in the woodwind section, particularly there's going to be 2 piccolos, there's going to be 4 flutes, so 2 flutes, 2 piccolos, and metallic percussion. That was one of the things that came first for me, is I had this sort of rushing, very metallic sound that I knew, and this was the very first sketch that I wrote, actually. And the material is very, very linked to what's going on in the violins, but it's much more chromatic, it's much faster moving, it's more complex harmonically. There's more sort of tonal inflections and clarity in the violin music, which moves in sort of wide space parallels. Towards the end of the piece, there's this very expressive, quite ornate 2-part violin material, which is related to what's happened at the beginning of the piece, but it's much more expressive. It's much more related also to the sort of long melodic lines that are in that central, very distant, muted section as well. I think also players really appreciate it. So the piece might be really difficult, but you know, if they can tell that you really mean every note, and that, you know, you've actually put a huge amount of effort into it, and that, you know, I think what they really don't like is when they feel that composers are writing things and they can't really hear what they're writing, or they, you know, if there are wrong notes and things that are going wrong, that doesn't really bother them. I think they really appreciate it if you know, you really know what you want, and you know, they'll be more forgiving then if there are some things that are not perfect.
We all need new art and new culture. We need it to be living. And we're at a time where Britain has, arguably the most gifted generation of composers from under 50 of any country at all. And it's a gold mine, so we'd be idiots not to be picking out these nuggets.
Well, I've now finished the piece. Finally, I'm starting to think it wasn't going to get finished. It's been a lot of work, actually. It's this very detailed piece, so it's probably about 4.5 minutes long. But there's a lot going on in those 4.5 minutes. So it's something that I've drafted a lot, and it's gone through a number of stages, but it's now in the final editing stage, so happy about that. I think last time we spoke, I had sort of part of the opening fanfare, and I had these 2 types of material, and that's very much stayed the same. I had a sort of a rough idea for the shape of the piece and for the main sort of event that comes at the climax of the piece, which is where you've got this huge tutti. There's a lot going on. There's a sort of it's layered, and there's sort of three layers to the texture, and then suddenly at that point you're submerged into this sort of inner world. The outer world breaks through at various points, and then you have the 2 things juxtaposed. The end of the piece is quite a sort of mechanical version of this inner world, so it sort of is open-ended. And I wanted it to be that way because this piece is then going to be part of a much larger work. So it's going to be very connected to what I write after it, but it also is a complete thing in itself.
There is an intelligence and a brilliance and a point, but I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see how she develops. And she's at this time in her life where every piece is going to be an enormous step forward. And I'm so curious to see the first notes. It's one of the great feelings, is to say, okay, what are we going to create that's new this season? And what are going to be the notes that have never been heard? And very often that very first rehearsal, putting down the first note and hearing, So here we are, there's a new baby in the world. One of the things that the London Symphony Orchestra has always felt is that we're in a living culture. We're no type of museum. They were always looking forward to this. And for me, the thrill is to see what new pieces can not only be in themselves, but how they can affect the repertoire around them, how they can affect the way in which we hear other pieces. But just simply, we want to hear what's new. There couldn't be anything more exciting than that.
For me, I've got to sort of add something new into that mix, and that's pretty daunting, but I think it's really exciting that they've commissioned something for the concert as well. I think it's really, hopefully, going to give a great showcase of some of what's going on in Britain at the